Have you ever wanted to study archaeology? Well, stick with us. And here to talk about biblical archaeology once again is Titus Kennedy. Titus is a professor of archaeology, and he actually also has gotten out there and gotten his hands dirty in the field. The book, Unearthing the Bible. Titus, we've had you with us once before, and so interesting. We got to continue this discussion.
Great to be here with you again, Gary.
Let's, first of all, let people know who you are, a little bit about your background, because we're going to be talking about this book. It's called Unearthing the Bible, and this is, I think, a unique book. I've read a lot of books, and before we talk about your book, let's talk about you.
Sure. Well, as you said, I'm an archaeologist. That is my main profession and really my passion in life, too. And especially as archaeology connects to the Bible. And I got started in archaeology, I guess I could say, way back in 4th grade when my teacher gave me a book about the excavation of Troy, that city that is talked about in Homer's Iliad. And before that, I was familiar with history, and I liked history and ancient history, but I didn't really know that archaeology existed. And so I read this book, and I found that, people actually go to find these ancient cities that are written about in these texts, and they dig them up, and they find the buildings, they find the artifacts, and then we have all this new information that's provided to us that gives us a better picture of the ancient past, or even confirms these things that were written. And as time went on, I was more and more interested in reading ancient history and archaeology. My dad gave me some books about archaeology connected to the Bible, and finally at the end of high school I decided that I wanted to try to study archaeology in college and university. So I started doing that and volunteering on some excavations, and I just kept going, did a master's degree, did some digs in Israel, did another master's, finally did a doctorate, and now I've been directing some of my own archaeology projects and writing articles and doing research, and finally this book here.
Now, let's get to the book. And by the way, you are a professor at Biola College, and so you kind of keep your roots down, keep your feet on the ground, but you do travel to various digs and so forth. Actually, a very exciting life, if you ask me. Sort of beats my stay at home and read a book at my desk life, but that's another story. I'm looking at your book, Unearthing the Bible, and the thing that just absolutely bowled me over when I first opened this book, went to the table of contents, and I discovered that you not only have very important discoveries, each of them with a beautiful photography so that you can actually see what's being written about. But your chapters are in order. The first chapter, Stories of Creation. Second chapter, the Israelites in Egypt. Chapter 3, Conquest, Settlement, and the Period of the Judges. United Monarchy, Shattered Kingdoms, and you just sort of take us through biblical history, and you make these important stops along the way. Well, I have never seen a book on archaeology done this way before, as openly and as easily to follow as this thing is. I have never seen this before, and I thought, people need to see this book.
I thought that approach would make it easier for people to follow and to get interested in the content, and also if they were studying a particular book or passage, then they could quickly look it up and reference. They can look in the chapters, like you said. They're divided up chronologically, and then in the parentheses it shows which books of the Bible would be covered in that. And there's also an appendix where you can go at the back and you can look and see which books and which passages and the page number. So developing it chronologically and historically, I got that idea or realized the importance of that idea, because when I teach my classes, I like to have that as the framework, the story that we can work through, because people have already got some kind of story and history in their head.
Right.
And then you can just attach those facts and that information and those other stories to that, rather than just throwing out random names, dates, places, which then you have to try to figure out how to organize. That can be really difficult to remember and to see where that fits in the context of everything.
Now, one of my favorite verses in the Bible is in the closing chapter of Daniel, the 12:4, where Daniel is told, "But thou, O Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book, even to the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro. Knowledge shall be increased." That last phrase, knowledge shall be increased. I think your book is a good illustration of that. That is to say, we've had a lot of knowledge in the last 200-300 years, archaeology, linguistics, and so forth, just academic, tons of academic material. But now we're beginning to put stories together and look back, and we can see how absolutely real the Bible is in its connection with archaeology. This has not always been the case, and you and I talked about that.
Yeah, absolutely. The discipline of archaeology is fairly new in the grand scheme of things, but really it wasn't until the 1800s when archaeology started to be developed, and what we know now, the techniques that we use, most of that is within the last 100 years or so. If we go back to the 19th century and we look at the amount of information they had in terms of archaeology connected to the Bible, very, very tiny. Today, we have a huge amount of material. And so, like you said, yeah, knowledge is increasing, especially in this area. Whereas people could criticize the Bible more before the 1800s in terms of saying, we read about this, but we don't have any physical evidence of that. Today, we have so much, all these sites that have been discovered, all of these artifacts that have been discovered that are showing the historical accuracy of many of the passages in the Bible.
I'm looking at page 18 here, the Mesopotamian version of the flood, and I study a little history here and there, and the Greeks have their story of their flood. Mm-hmm. For example, I mean, Homer calls it the Great Flood of Deucalion. Yeah. And there are other versions. There's the biblical version, but I can remember reading that nobody's really sure. Maybe there wasn't even a flood. Maybe it was a made-up narrative. You know, a couple hundred years ago, they were talking like that. Mm-hmm. And now we're beginning to find supporting narratives that we can correlate with each other, and you've got that here in this book. And you go to page 18, the Mesopotamian version of the flood, and that's really fascinating. Tell us about that.
Yeah, there are a number of ancient flood stories that we know of now, but I focus on these Mesopotamian ones because they're the oldest in terms of the actual texts or artifacts that we have. One tablet was recently rediscovered, published. It came into the British Museum. It was owned by a private collector, and the curator there then translated it, and he saw that this was the oldest version of what's called the Atrahasis story of the flood. And this tablet dates to about 1900 BC, so we're talking almost 500 years before Moses wrote down in Genesis. And yet this tablet has so many of the same details there. And we look at all these different stories of the flood. It's essentially telling the same story from a different perspective. The biblical account, however, usually has a lot more detail than some of these others. But it's just very interesting to see that the ancients in general, they acknowledged, they remembered that this flood happened, and a lot of the cultures wrote about it.
I love to study the period of Balaam and Balaam the false prophet. And here on page 64, you've got Balaam the seer. And that one really got to me in a way, because it brings home the setting of Balaam's false prophecies. And you can actually, when you see something like this, and this is item 24 in your book, again, going chronologically through the archaeological discoveries and all the way up to the time of Jesus, by the way, which we'll talk about before we're through. But here on page 64, Balaam the Seer. And somebody actually wrote about Balaam.
They did. Yeah, this comes from a few hundred years after the time of Balaam. Maybe they were working off of an earlier text that they had copied, but that particular discovery, it was written in ink on the wall inside a room. And they're recounting some of the story of Balaam's life, his name, his occupation, where he's from, and then it talks about some dreams that he has. And that gives us really solid evidence that Balaam not only existed, but that he was known in that region where the Israelites encounter him in what today is Jordan.
You have essentially validated the Bible from another viewpoint, not regarding any of these inscriptions as in the same light as Scripture, but just validating what was going on. And what really got you started? I mean, that is, what was one of the things that you discovered for yourself that just really excited you?
I would say that it was more of a collection of discoveries. As I was reading through books on archaeology in the Bible, I became interested and astounded even at finding that there were so many things that confirmed the historical accuracy of the text, whether it be the discovery of cities or a particular building or an artifact that's talked about in Scripture or an inscription that confirms a person or an event. And I just saw also how this evidence continued to build over the years. And there's so much yet to be discovered. And I wanted to be involved in not only discovering those new things, but there's also a lot of historical debates or problems where some people would say that the text of this biblical passage tells us one thing, but we found something in archaeology and we think that it contradicts. And so I'm also really interested in looking at those historical problems and showing how what's found in archaeology actually confirms the Bible. It doesn't contradict it.
Now, each of the stories in this book is accompanied by a color photograph and a little date discovered and a period in which this thing was discovered, keywords, Bible passages to which this particular archaeological find is related. And I'm looking at the gold of Ophir here on page 104. This is at the end of chapter 4. And, you know, when I read the Bible and Solomon, you know, built his temple, and I kept reading about the gold of Ophir. I'm saying, I wonder where that place was. I wonder if maybe it wasn't even real. I mean, nobody knows. And yet you refer to it here. There's a secondary reference.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we have an inscription from the period of the kingdom which talks about Ophir, and so we know that it was a real place. We don't know exactly where it's located. There are some good theories, hypotheses, I think, on that, but we know for certain it was real and it was a source of gold.
And you'd sure like to find that place today. It would be fun to find the actual gold of Ophir.
Definitely.
Let's go through, and again, I'm looking at the table of contents. I've never seen a more interesting table of contents in my whole life. Because chapter 1, stories of creation. Chapter 2, the Israelites in Egypt. Chapter 3, conquest, settlement to the period of the Judges. Chapter 4, the united monarchy of Saul. Chapter 5, shattered kingdoms. Wow. Now, we remember a period after David and Solomon, and then going into the years after that talk about shattered kingdoms. It was just a horrific time in many ways, and things were lost in that period. That is to say, chronologies and actualities. And so you have kind of document the fact here that we can go back and see that what was happening in that horrible period.
Yeah, in fact, the period of the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, they're some of the best documented archaeologically in the Old Testament. The level of corroboration, the level of text to archaeological artifacts coinciding is incredible, considering that this was almost 3,000 years ago. So many of the nations, the cultures around Israel and Judah that interacted with them, they write about the Israelites or about the Judeans. Or we have some inscriptions from Israel and Judah that they wrote about themselves, or artifacts, buildings that have been discovered. For example, Ahab, who we read that he had this ivory house in his palace in Samaria. Well, when excavations were being done at Samaria, they found this room in the palace that was filled with these ivory pieces, very intricately carved, that they had imported the ivory and then had artisans carve all these designs, and presumably they were on pieces of furniture and then perhaps some on the wall. It's just something mentioned in passing in Scripture, a little historical detail, but this was then discovered by archaeologists.
And you learn more about what it is, and not only do you validate that this was real, but suddenly it's got other things connected with it. Linking, I suppose, ideas linked together, inscriptions and so forth. To me, that's the beauty of archaeology, to validate what has been lost. And that's particularly interesting in the biblical sense because, again, in this world, we have to defend Scripture. And there are a lot of critics out there who say, that may or may not be real. Somebody just made that up. The prophet so-and-so just, he just thought he had a dream and he wrote this. But there's nothing that really validates it. Well, yes, there is. You go back, and if you look hard enough, you're going to find validation.
And as more sites get excavated, more and more artifacts, buildings, cities, villages are discovered which are connected to the text of the Bible.
Let's get to maybe some of your favorites in this book. Anything you'd like to really just spend a little time on?
Sure. The number 22 in the Exodus chapter, that's one of my favorites, and I think actually one of the most significant pieces in the book. It's also something that is not known by many people at all. This is an inscription that mentions the Nomads of Yahweh. It's actually located in what's now northern Sudan, but in ancient times this was part of Egypt, southernmost part of Egypt. So it was a temple, or it was inside of a temple, that was constructed by the Pharaoh Amenhotep III. So he was in power during the end of the wandering period and the conquest under Joshua. And like many other Egyptian pharaohs, he would have lists made and inscribed in temples that would show who he had supposedly defeated or places he had defeated, who was under subjection to him. So this is part of a much larger list of cities to the east of Egypt primarily. But some of the list contains mention of people, and particularly nomads. And these nomad groups are identified in terms of a god that they worship, or perhaps a leader, and sometimes it's a geographical area. But one of those says the land of the nomads of Yahweh. And this is the earliest inscription that's ever been discovered that mentions Yahweh. Well, we know that in ancient times, only the Israelites worshiped Yahweh. That name does not come up in texts of other cultures.
So the Egyptians heard the word Yahweh, and they translated it into their own hieroglyphics. And you've got a couple of pictures with this, and you can actually see the hieroglyphs.
Yeah, exactly. They just took the name and then they rendered it in their writing system in Egyptian hieroglyphs.
Sounded it out, as we used to say in grade school.
Exactly.
And wrote and by the way, that's not easy. Hieroglyphic writing is very complex, and even translating that must have been fascinating. But to see this, and again, we're talking about what? How many centuries BC?
This is about 1400 BC.
About 1400. And so we have a record of the wilderness march in Sudan. Fascinating. But again, when you open this book, it's just full of quote unquote fascinating things. I mean, really, stuff you've never thought of, and each one accompanied by a photo that, to me, brings it down to earth. And I'm just, pardon me while I just look at the book, okay? Never mind. What should we, again, gauging the importance of this, and you wrote it so that people could make the connection between archaeology and biblical truth. And that's why I read the passage from Daniel, because there was a time when this sort of truth was not available. And Daniel predicted that in the last days, people would increase in their knowledge. And I think this is part of that.
Yeah, definitely. And again, as I said before, we just continue to find more and more. It's actually amazing to me the amount of information, the facts, the objects that have been preserved over the thousands of years that connect to all these different parts of the Bible. It's not something that you see so much with other historical texts. And yet we have this preservation, all these things under the ground still waiting to be found.
Here's one on page 164, and it's the famous Cyrus Cylinder, which has become even more famous in our era because Cyrus is being celebrated, and Donald Trump has got a famously crafted coin with his profile superimposed over Cyrus's profile. And everybody remembers that Cyrus helped the Jews come back and rebuild in Israel. And so there's a lot being said about Cyrus. And the return from exile cylinder is really one of the high points in archaeology, right?
It is, definitely. It tells parts of that whole story. It talks about how Babylon was taken without a battle, which if we read through Daniel, we see that is the case. There's the big feast that they're having, Daniel and Belshazzar, and the handwriting on the wall. And then the city it's suddenly taken. There's no mention of a battle. But then the text, that cylinder, it goes on to give Cyrus's proclamation that the people who have been taken away into exile by the Babylonians and their religious objects stolen, it says they can go back to where they're from and they can take those objects with them, and he'll restore their temples. And if we read the book of Ezra, we see that same proclamation issued in Ezra, just specifically rendered for the Jews and the temple in Jerusalem. So the Cyrus Cylinder is written more to a Babylonian audience, but it has the same overall decree, whereas in Ezra we see his specific instructions regarding the Jews' return to Jerusalem.
Now, moving on through the book, one of my favorites here, and I read this and I read it again because, and it's number 90, The Altar to the Unknown God. And of course, we all know the story about Paul in Athens, and he talked to the people in the Agora, and he said, while I was on my way into here, I just happened to notice an inscription to the unknown God. Well, you've got a couple of pictures here. Tell us about that.
So this altar to the unknown God, it seems to have originated maybe back in the 6th century BC when there was a plague in Athens and they didn't know what to do. They were trying to give sacrifices to every god to stop it. And they finally had this idea, maybe there's some god that we're missing, so we'll make an altar to this unknown God. Well, that idea persisted, and by the time Paul got there, he was able to use that as an illustration to tell the people of Athens that the real God is this unknown one to you. And so he takes something that they have inscribed and had there for many, many years, and he is able to lead that into presenting the gospel and the story of Jesus Christ to them. Some of these altars are actually mentioned by other ancient authors from around the time of Paul and the early church, and then some have been even rediscovered. So we know it was a real thing. It wasn't just an allegory or a metaphor that Paul was trying to use.
And you'll find amazing facts like this all the way through this book, the Unearthing the Bible, pardon me. This is my personal copy. It's got my bookmarks in it. I'm keeping this one. Seriously, if you are interested in the Bible, Bible narratives, Bible history, and you want to see archaeological discoveries laid out along a timeline and presented in a way that you, the non-academic, can just read them, enjoy them, and discover the truth behind them. Titus has just done a wonderful job. It's called Unearthing the Bible, and we're offering this to you for $25, shipping included anywhere in the United States. Go to our online bookstore, Prophecy Watchers. Click on the online bookstore, scroll down, you'll find Titus's name, Dr. Titus Kennedy, and you'll find this book, and also we're going to include, as we usually do, some aligned offers that go with what we're doing. Biblical archaeology, we've done a couple of presentations in the past, and we have to go with this book. Biblical archaeology comes alive with Randall Price, Tim Mahoney, Aaron Lipkin, Michael Lake. We have another volume with Aaron and Randall and Michael, Timothy Alberino, Tim Mahoney. We have as an accompanying package here that will just, I think, just thrill you if you're in the least bit interested in the archaeology of the Bible. For your gift of $75, we'll ship all three of these items to you, free shipping anywhere in the U.S. Check the online bookstore, prophecywatchers.tv. Scroll down and you'll find the archaeological discovery package. That's easy for me to say. It's probably easier for you to say, but I've really enjoyed talking to you, Titus. So where are you going to go from here? What are you going to be doing?
I'm actually working on another book that's going to focus on locations of the Bible, whereas this one focuses on objects or artifacts. And then I have some excavation publications to finish, and working on starting some new projects, digging up some more cities of the Bible.
Titus Kennedy, thanks for being on Prophecy Watchers.
Thanks for having me, Gary.
I'm Gary Stearman. Hey, you keep watching. We are. Thanks for joining us on Prophecy Watchers. You can find us on the web at prophecywatchers.com, where you can sign up for our free email newsletter, or follow us at facebook.com/prophecywatchers. In the meantime, keep watching, everybody, and we'll see you soon.